So almost 5 years ago, Crystal Bridges opened its doors as an art museum in an Ozark forest. Today, we stand in a place that's much more than an art museum. It's a community center. Every day, from people of all backgrounds walk the trails, spend an afternoon with the masterwork of American art, or watch the reflections of light dance on the Arkansas pine beams above their heads. Visitors, more than 2.5 million since opening in 2011, leave here feeling inspired by the American spirit. Tonight, we have the pleasure to host David Levin and Stella Betts, two people who embody the creativity, innovation, and experimentation associated with the American character. Truly, I don't know if I've ever met two people who are so excited about what they do. Their passion persuades them to push boundaries and challenge traditions of their fields. For them, architecture is an inhabited art form. Their work, like many of the paintings and sculptures in this museum, celebrates materials, facilitates human interaction with the natural world, and persuades us to discover our environment through altered lenses. Obsessed with the considered process of articulating space, Levin Betts beautifully explore the evolution of an abstract form into an inhabited structure. Levin Betts is an award-winning New York City-based architecture practice. The office was founded by Levin and Betts in 1997 and focuses on the design at all scales, including urban design, public architecture, houses and housing, commercial workspaces, exhibitions, and furniture. Central to their work is the idea of an architecture that engages its urban and natural environment. The office has won 6 New York City AIA awards, most notably for its urban design and housing proposal entitled PHX Case by Case, Cactus Flower Housing, and for a parking garage project called Chicago Filter Parking, which is part of a larger ongoing study that applies new sustainable transportation solutions and green planting systems to aging infrastructures. The office has recently been awarded a project for a 300,000 square foot commercial building in Harlem through the New York City Economic Development Corporation. Levin Betts was selected by the Architecture League of New York for the 2009 Emerging Voices series, Architectural Records 2007 Design Vanguard, and the 2003 Young Architects Forum. Moreover, the office's work has been exhibited internationally in New York, Berlin, Seoul, China, Washington, D.C., and the Center for Architecture in Manhattan. A monograph of the first 10 years of the office's work called Pattern Recognition was published in 2009 by Princeton Architectural Press, which again is available for a book signing after the lecture. Most importantly, David and Stella are gracious, intelligent, and incredibly funny. I've enjoyed my day with them. Their passion is infectious and deeply inspirational, and I know you will all feel the same way. So please join me in welcoming David and Stella to Crystal Bridges.
Good evening. Thank you, Dylan, for bringing us here and for that incredibly kind introduction. We also want to thank Chip and Susan Chambers and Ken and Liz, who we met this afternoon, for their generous support. And of course, thank all of you for coming. We've had kind of an incredible day beginning at 4 a.m. in Manhattan. And we've also just had this incredible experience with Dylan, becoming acquainted with the museum here. And we're obviously humbled to be amongst this artwork and in this incredible building and in this amazing landscape. And this sort of interrelationship between landscape and building is something that we're going to be talking about.
So I think the conversation tonight is really comes out of a conversation we've had with Dylan, but also one that we've been talking a lot about in our practice and the process, the translation from art to architecture. So what we want to do is kind of frame the discussion tonight based on that. So we're going to show some artwork that we are sure is extremely familiar to all of us in the room, and that's kind of intentional. We chose some pieces that that most of us will know as a way to quickly kind of develop a common language that sets up some key principles of the way in which we work in part of our process. And then we're going to show you some pieces of our own work that we did before we did architecture and kind of during the time while we were in architecture school. And then we're going to run through a series of projects.
And we'll be touching back to these key principles throughout the discussion, sometimes directly and other times by implication.
Right. So very quickly, we're going to just start and talk about kind of the key elements of some of these artists. So this couple of Bryce Marden pieces on the left, what we loved is this sort of idea of inversion, the solid in the middle or something on the perimeter. And then these beautiful kind of ink drawings that talk about a layering and a density for us that speaks to us about structure and space and light.
Agnes Martin's grid paintings and works, drawings, where the grid is explicit, or the grid is shifted or manipulated or rendered through different types of notations.
And the idea of seeing the grid from close up versus far away. Sol LeWitt comes up a lot for us, especially in a piece that we're going to talk about. And again, the idea of the grid, but the three-dimensional grid in this case, and then the different sort of ways of manipulating that grid and the infinite possibilities within that sort of very simple system.
Donald Judd in these images at Marfa, and specifically in these images, the idea of the minimalist object in relation to its architectural context and its specific landscape context, especially in this incredible West Texas environment.
And his idea of these permanently installed pieces in those landscapes. And then here also at Marfa with Judd, the simplicity of one material, the manipulation of these rectilinear forms and the idea of framing a landscape, and the iterative process and the infinite possibilities within a very, very simple strategy of form making.
Also, Judd at Marfa, these are many of the buildings that he worked in, renovated, and installed pieces in. And there's this a couple of kind of key ideas about placemaking, revitalization, and kind of an incredible sense of sustainability, an incredible definition of sustainability in the idea of revitalizing previous architectures.
These three Duchamp pieces, which are going to be very familiar to everyone, but are very relevant for us as architects. The idea of the door that is mounted in the sort of double frame, the ambiguity of the sort of open or close, so taking a very kind of ubiquitous architectural element like a door and then creating some ambiguity. The very sort of famous found objects, but what we're interested in here is the idea of the use and the misuse of something, and that's something that comes up very much in terms of an idea of some of the projects and the ways that we approach the work. And then in the three standard stoppages, the idea of both a constrained context and then the idea of chance and, again, iteration that has a real influence in our work.
And plumbing.
And plumbing, yes, infrastructure.
These pieces by Carl Andre that obviously hug the floor and create place and space through the simple act of laying materials down that are very, very thin, but still, due to their material intensivity, create an intense sense of place.
And then these other pieces by Carl Andre, again, sort of this iterative process of very, very simple form being reconfigured, the infinite sort of possibilities of that form, and also kind of using very industrial, raw material and working within that.
Also, Carl Andre pieces, and we're going to talk a lot about text tonight in our work. But in Andre's work, text is highly manipulable. Words change direction, letters run into one another, colors change, other words are formed through the collision of two or more words put in combination with one another.
And similarly, these Mel Bachner pieces, very similar in that sense to the Carl Andre, but both the kind of more formal paintings of the text and then the very informal kind of writing and the sort of process-oriented text.
And language, he says language is not transparent. In our work, sometimes it actually is, physically.
Which you'll see in a
But it's
project.
not, because it's so powerful, and that's why we love to use and misuse language.
And then, of course, Christopher Wool and the idea of the kind of run-on of words and then the sort of finding of the other words within that, similar to the Carl Andre pieces.
Gordon Matta Clark, obviously, this idea of calling into question the domestic through cutting, specifically splitting, but also the kind of highly aestheticized move and geometric moves of coring and cutting with pure forms like circles in buildings slated for demolition, which makes one rethink what that building is all about.
And what we like to also think about is that sort of framing of the outside and the connection, and also where the sort of light comes in through the cracks.
And similarly, Sarah Oppenheimer is a contemporary artist who also cores and cuts through buildings in almost incredibly surreal ways, but also highly designed, curving the plywood, certain surfaces highly polished, others made matte.
And then the Dan Graham pieces, again, the kind of relationship to the site and context and landscape, but also the reflectivity, the translucency, the layering of spaces, the reflecting of the context.
And these images by the Korean artist Do Ho-seo of either habitational spaces, circulation spaces, or simple mundane plumbing fixtures, literally, that are rendered in translucent fabric. Again, sort of calling into question what these things are and what their usage is really all about.
We look at a lot of film, actually, and we only just chose this one shot from a Wes Anderson film. And there's a lot about film and perspective and views and point of view that we're interested in and want to talk about. But in this case, just the sort of, the section through the ship, the boat, and the sort of singular one-point perspective that you end up getting through each sort of compartment. And
each compartment has a different activity. If we could zoom into the picture, you could see people doing different things in each of those frames. And these are a couple of images, a few slides that we're going to show of artwork that actually Stella and I did years ago independently of one another before we started our practice, before we knew one another. And in these images, the idea of the sort of the positioning of a square within a field and the movement of that square to activate the space around it, to manipulate the material, which is mylar, in different ways to make the paper buckle, or to make it shine, or to erase completely the image.
Different framing.
Also, just these ideas of rubbing of a mundane, actually the board end of a 2x12 to reveal its structure while also speaking about the materiality of the rubbing and of the surface of the mylar itself. Also, these different types of surface treatments, shiny and matte, translucent, thin, thick, drilled right into the surface, different ways of manipulating a standard 8.5 by 11 sheet, which is a paper size for a piece of plywood.
These are some photograms, actually, that were using light as a way of drawing and constructing. So literally just at the scale of the hand and folding and then exposing light-sensitive paper and using that as a way to construct drawings. And so this is just sort of a detail of that, of the paper folded, and doing this all actually by memory and in the darkness of a room, and actually then revealing the drawing itself once it's in the photo emulsion.
In these images, these photographic images of sort of erased industrial sites on the Brooklyn waterfront, looking back towards Manhattan and really working on this idea of point of view and shifting point of view. So this idea of relative legibility, which we're going to talk about in certain projects, looking down the score joints in a sort of a destroyed or erased concrete slab towards Manhattan and shifting the body in order to create a slightly different point of view. And these are all works that, again, Stella and I did.
Not ours.
Not ours. Over 20 years ago, and we revisit them from time to time, and we think about what they still mean in our practice, the similarities between them, the differences, and where they keep coming up in our architecture work. Now to somebody else's work.
Yes. So actually, to then just frame the other sort of aspect of our practice, as Dylan referred to, we do work from the scale of furniture all the way to cities. So just kind of looking at the Eames powers of 10 is something that always is interesting to us to look at that. And this particular image of it is something that will come up in some of our other pieces. And what we love about this is the informality of placemaking. Just the blanket begins to define a space, and implied in a public space, in a park, putting down just a surface of a blanket begins to create a type of very informal domestic space of kitchen, sleeping, library, dining, just in that one image that we're really interested in. So now to our projects quickly. Actually, about a year and a half ago, we were given a prompt for a gallery show in Chelsea, curated by Andrew Zuckerman, and he asked 3 different architecture firms, ourselves, Stephen Hall, and Liang Liang. And the prompt was really just a theme called Unpacking the Cube. And really the only thing that was defined for this show was that it was not going to be a sort of traditional architecture show. So it was not about showing models of any of our work. He wanted us to make something about process and about this idea of unpacking the cube. So what we started with is literally just the cube itself, and very simply thinking, what's one move that we could do to manipulate it and come up with, which ultimately was then just one single shape. By just doing a 60-degree cut, this same shape just keeps getting rotated, so it only ends up being one. And then that was the cube in its four pieces. And what we also became interested in as architects, we're constantly making models at scales that are not the scale of a building, and then the kind of ubiquitous scale figure. So we started to look at these pieces, and for us, could read them at many different scales. At sort of the scale of almost like a toy block, a piece of furniture, or then all of a sudden, if you can see the person there, the scale of a building. And so the name of our project was called Not to Scale. And we had a sort of series of different iterations of that piece in which we investigated all these different scales.
So from the simple cube, the continuous exploration of this at different scales, as Stella said, but in different formulations, we found this to be absolutely infinite. And then, of course, we just ran a series of scenarios to investigate that, in those infinite possibilities.
So some of these are at the scale of what we imagine to be a building, a wall, and then these drawings that then kind of went back and abstracted that process in order to still kind of read the pieces at these different scales. So this was actually a full-scale drawing, and then some of these other iterations that began to even be sort of something similar to a facade of a building, or a kind of configuration of a sculptural piece that's an assembly of that one shape. Or something that almost looks like a landscape that you would see, flying over a sort of farming landscape.
And then the pieces themselves, again, just beginning with the simple idea of a 60-degree angle, which creates what's called a right trapezoid, if you will. We made them in a material called ultra-high performance concrete, which is incredibly strong, and therefore the walls of these pieces could be very, very thin. They are 5/8 of an inch thick, and we plan to stack them very high. So we actually worked with an engineer we wanted them even thinner, of course, but because we were going to stack them, that was essentially the thickness. These are the pieces arriving at the gallery, and then in conversation with these other pieces that investigated the cube, as you can see, the piece sort of acted like a larger block, but then descended to the floor. This is the chaise in conversation, with felt pads for incredible comfort.
And we want to make note of this for the next project, because this is a chaise, but it'll become a house in a moment. But for the show, it was at the scale of furniture. And then we've continued to sort of develop this into other furniture pieces that we can kind of go through quickly. For other proposals. And these are just these images of the infinite configurations, again, of this one shape. that came out of the cube that assembles into 4. And again, this sort of idea that this could be a building facade or a screen or a piece of furniture. And we're very interested in sort of the negative spaces. It goes back to the pieces we talked about, perspective as you shift along this piece, because it has a sort of open greater on one side versus the other. It sort of has these, like, it pinches and it opens up.
I think these ideas of the grid and the manipulation of the grid that we spoke about previously are quite evident in these pieces, as well as, and you're going to see this in a lot of our work, we love to work in model. We think that the feedback loop between making something physical that is to be something larger physical is much more immediate. We use, and you'll see renderings a lot for presentation, but model gives us an immediate kind of response to ourselves.
So at about the same time that we were working on the piece for the Chamber Gallery, we were developing a house, and we were thinking about campsite, the informality, maybe kind of similar to this sort of the picnic that we were just talking about. And love the idea that when camping, there are all these sort of isolated conditions, the water well, the sort of bathroom, if you will, the kitchen, the dining, the sleeping area. And that became a really important thing for us to think about, these sort of isolated conditions. And then as we were developing these pieces, we started thinking, well, great, so there's the dining room, there's a piece that's a living room, there's a piece that's a kitchen, and began to kind of imagine those as assemblies, as individual kind of domestic program.
So we, again, back to this idea about, let's say, the prioritization of space and the qualities of space over intense programming, we were interested in how these shapes, we could make one shape essentially, and just by placing them next to one another, you could accommodate a series of spaces. So an entry porch starting at the bottom right, to the kitchen, to the dining room, in relation to a barbecue area, an infrastructural block, and then another block looking towards what was sort of a clearing that was created.
Right. So these are the images of the model. You can see the similarity, as we were just talking about, with the sheds that become the sort of model of the house, the roof. That's the site plan. Some of the other things that we're super interested in is when you take a piece like the original pieces and then translate it into an architecture. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but the sort of structure and the infrastructure that has to happen, that's that translation that we're so interested in. It has to become something else. So in fact, we started with those very pure shapes, and then in the end, the roof had to kind of resolve, the upper floor had to resolve some structure and infrastructure, then that ended up being a parallelogram. And then these are some of the images on the inside, and one of the things to note is that idea of kind of the informal programming, like this could be the living room, this could be the dining room, but what we're interested in is where it opens up, and that you get sort of morning light in this room, and then in another room you might get afternoon light and it opens up on the other side, and then as you get to the sort of upper floor, you get this sort of pinched and then triangulated space based on this sort of geometry in the structure. And there's the house as it's under construction now. It should be done in a couple of months.
Hopefully sooner than that.
Some of the interior spaces, you begin to sort of see those views and that kind of framing of that landscape. So we also then want to talk about house to housing, and this is an interesting project for us because it really talks about, again, a single unit, one kind of actually shape of a single unit, and then multiplying it and doing different configurations. So looking at the unit, and then at the same time looking at the grid, and looking specifically at the kind of American grid, and then even more specifically to place Phoenix, where the grid is interrupted by a water distribution system. But starting with the idea of the unit and something in a very sort of very strong light as the desert. We actually took this one form that's not so dissimilar, and this is a project that came before the sort of pieces, the not-to-scale pieces at Chamber, and then just took that one form for a single unit and kept rotating it, basing it on an idea of a cactus with the infrastructure in the middle and the sort of corrugated edges for shade and shadow, and then basically just kind of rotated that piece and came up with a series of cactus flower houses, and then sort of iterated those same pieces.
Very much in the language
sort
of the not to scale piece.
Right.
This came several years actually before that. But also this idea that we looked at in the Carl Andre piece, of course, just taking a very simple form and rotating it and then placing it in space. In this case, placing it around a core that was made for circulation, but also for infrastructure.
Right. And then this sort of idea of really using that sort of light and shadow, that sort of deeper shade space, but is really being part of the kind of configuration of the facade itself. And then simultaneously looking at the city.
At the
grid.
urban scale, Phoenix is about 450 square miles. The classic gridded American city where the grid sprawls kind of regardless of the health of the interior of the grid, if you will. And then looking at the water system, again, freshwater drinking system that was all based, that is still based on similar pathways that the Hohokam peoples had created for the sustenance of their inhabitation of that area. And then looking at specific canals that clearly runs counter to a gridded structure, right? The grid of the city. And then looking at a couple of key intersections between this grid and this, let's say, crosscut or cross current to the grid, which is the canal system.
So these are just a series of these sort of studies, and then here the model that actually came apart, showing the sort of figure of the canal, which is really, the disruption of that grid, and really that was traditionally kind of more of a back door of the city, and really prioritizing it and creating a kind of urban amenity along that canal. So these are images of a model that sort of came apart that was both the grid with the sort of the disruption of that piece, the planning of the sort of housing and the program that went with that, the sort of public thoroughfare along the canal itself.
And we were really interested in, because we felt that the city had sort of turned inside out in a sense, looking away from its freshwater infrastructure. We wanted to sort of turn it right side in, if you will, to make the sort of patterns of living completely conscious of what sustains it, if you will.
So this idea of place, we really, to sort of introduce the next round of projects, we've been doing some libraries for Brooklyn Public Library, and starting with the Brooklyn Heights Interim Library. And this is a library that is housed now, the site was given to us as a church in Brooklyn Heights. And so we're interested in the sort of history and the sort of original building, and then to the history of Brooklyn Heights itself.
It's the parish hall of a church called Our Lady of Lebanon. Right. And again, as Stella said, it's an interim library, so it's sort of a pop-up in a sense, and it'll be there for about 4 years. But again, even though it's interim, the idea of making place and understanding place. So kind of understanding the growth of Brooklyn Heights, if you will, and the growth and the change of the library itself as it was formulated and then moved around. And then also the key figure of Walt Whitman, who's the Bard of Brooklyn, and looking at a poem that he wrote called Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, and bringing the text of that poem into the library itself, which we'll show you in a moment. This is just a very simple little model that we made about the way we configured the space. And again, a pop-up library, not a permanent space, but also making a key move in that library.
So here's the finished look.
Yeah.
So this is what the space looked originally. It had 2 window walls, and we were really looking at kind of creating an open kind of public space. When that one move that David mentioned of this sort of wall that bellies out for a multi-purpose room and a librarian room. But probably the most important to us is the kind of translucency of this room with shared light, and then this text of the Walt Whitman poem, Crossing the Brooklyn Ferry, that runs along this wall, so that you actually get this sort of reading of the text in partial fragments, and also over the course of time. And as you sort of spend time in the library, you slowly have the opportunity to sort of see these pieces.
The poem the poem occupies, it doesn't repeat. It's one poem. It's one approximately 100-foot long wall, but it's strung out. So in order to read it, you'd have to keep walking back and forth 100 feet at a time. And the intention here was to play with the text, actually to rethink the stanza structure while still keeping its linearity, literally very linear, But then when one is in the space, you create another poem for yourself, and Whitman's poetry is so much like that. It's about a wash of words and inspirations and emotions.
And the idea that you sort of hear fragments of conversations all the time in cities and in sort of public spaces. And then this sort of mixing of that, the layering of the text with the material itself that allows for this kind of translucency within the sort of more private spaces of the library.
Language is translucent,
Right.
not transparent.
Right. But then we're also always interested, exactly, in the sort of extension or the expanded site. And in this case, the other sort of entry at the back side of the church where we needed to create an entry for strollers. And so we really took this idea of text and put it on this old wall. And so again, kind of allowing that to be sort of an embedded part of the architecture. And then as you kind of walk along, you get the sort of words that are at the sort of different scales. And then we're also working on another library for Brooklyn Public Libraries, and this is in a very different location in East Flatbush. And here we want to talk a little bit about the community again, but also the sort of larger history of libraries. But this is in a very different community.
It's a Caribbean, African-American neighborhood, by and large. It's right in the center of Brooklyn. This next image is a sort of a word map of all of the neighborhoods of Brooklyn. East Flatbush, we can point to it, is right in the middle, pretty much of the borough. And we were, again, text is coming into this project in a huge way. But currently, this is the existing library, and it's pretty distressed. But it also just affords an incredible opportunity, we think. I mean, the library, it's sort of a classic single-story library from this sort of 70s, early 80s era. They're called, in New York City, a lot of them were built under a mayor named Lindsay, so they're called Lindsay boxes. And they're often quite dark in the middle. So
and that darkness brings us to, we also wanted to sort of take
to the light.
To the light. We wanted to sort of take a bigger step back and think about like traditional sort of libraries, the sort of central reading room that's flooded with light, both traditional and even obviously contemporary. So one of the main moves, this is a photograph of the model. So this is sort of the plan of the model. Here's the facade, which we're going to talk about. And actually this is the roof kind of tipped up, like as if it's hinged. Because what we really, what we were creating is this sort of central reading room that then gets flooded with light. And that was sort of one of the main ideas, and also to open it up to the street.
So as Stella said, the reading room is largely translucent, glowing, very, very light materials, except for the furniture is all wood, where one touches a material, it has the warmth of wood. The perimeter rooms are much smaller, lower ceilings, and are currently actually now they're all clad in wood as well. So they're kind of like wood caves played off against this utter translucency of the reading room.
And
the
then you
dotted
see
material is acoustic and varied. It's a very interesting material.
And this is sort of obviously the interior images and just kind of flooding that space with light and the connection to the street. Then we also want to talk about the facade. Back to text.
Yeah. So the facade is it's an irregularly corrugated metal facade consisting of a very soft matte field and shiny letters placed onto that field. And because of the angles of the facade, it creates what's called a lenticular reading, where you read one thing from one side and one from the other. Here in this image, you're seeing from the east, you read East Flatbush. And in the next, you read library. When you're looking straight on, you can kind of make out, and it's intentional that it's perhaps not quite clear, like language is not quite clear. And we really love this idea of different approaches to language and to legibility, especially in the location of the library.
Yeah. And then also thinking about the interiors, we actually took again some text and poetry from a local poet, and then began to take that text and manipulate it and sort of cut it and rotate it and start to think about that as a graphic that then started to get played out through the interior in this sort of children's area or at the information desk. So again, sort of seeing text at these different scales, these different levels of abstraction, and to some degree even thinking about the sort of the legibility from a distance versus close up and the abstraction that you get from
It's
that.
a text from a poet, African-American poet named Nikki Giovanni. I think it was in the late 40s. And we took apart the text, and the poem is about libraries, actually.
Right.
So you're seeing like little snippets, library, freedom, dreams.
Space.
So we were really interested in sort of pulling apart the text, but still having certain key moments from that poem legible.
So again, about place and space, we've been doing some work at Cornell University, and this is a project at Sibley Hall. Sibley Hall is located here, and we were working on this part of the building. This is all Sibley Hall. This is Milstein Hall by OMA. This is actually the architecture school, and it's located on the Arts Quad. And what we were particularly interested in, even though it was an interior, to think about here is the sort of diagram of the drawing showing the Arts Quad and the relationship of that part of the building to the other buildings. We were really thinking about like an interior campus, or what we kind of often call an urban interior. And the main move was to really start to connect that portion of the building with the other aspects of the building, and to also think about the sort of discussion between old and new, certainly in terms of some of the Judd aspects that we were talking about, the sort of existing building and that historical structure. And in this case, this is where the site of our project was, or is. And this is some images from the existing space before we did the work. That's the plan, and we're going to be talking in a moment about this. So if you just notice, these are this existing and the structure that we changed. We made these openings here in order to create a more sort of open connection that goes to another part of the building.
To facilitate this connective space, as Stella was talking about.
And these become these structural frames that become frames inside of frames inside of frames, which is something that we were really interested in, these different thresholds.
And the idea here was we had to open up the space in order to make it function, and to make it function for these academic programs the way it was mandated. So the structural frame, as Stella showed, the 3 frames of different sizes, became this important kind of marker as one moved through the space. Right.
So sorry, this was the first one that makes the connection. So that's a new connection through the wall, so you see through. That's the first frame. This is the second frame. And then this is the third frame that opens it up.
And the third frame is in the place of a previous just a very large masonry wall, and so through a fairly dramatic sort of surgical demolition, we were able to take that out and to replace it with this frame.
Those 2 words together.
Well, remember? Designed by one of the world's best engineers, is holding up the building beautifully. But it allowed for this movement, this academic exchange that now needed to happen in this space that had previously been an attic and chopped up with these walls.
And one of the things that we're interested also, and we're finding a lot, is that this is a space for architecture students and studio space, but it's used for lots of different purposes. So a lot of the kind of space making that we're doing is very specific to the types of spaces and the quality of light, and less about sort of programmatically specific. This image is kind of one of our favorites because it really shows the sort of old and the new coming together, the old structure. This is a kind of obviously new mesh ceiling, all the sort of celebrating the old, the perimeter, and we replaced all these windows, and then obviously the new structure, and all of that in kind of a very didactic conversation because it's an architecture school. So structure, old and new structure, and sort of color coded, and these are all the different sort of frames again. And the quality of light, we replaced all the skylights, and then here again sort of the new faculty office doors and some of the structural tie rods that needed to occur.
But we were also just interested in, instead of a sort of a clash of old and new, a nuanced discussion between old and new. So there's a palette sort of running through that sometimes the same color, let's say, or shade of gray or white might apply to an old or a new. So that was kind of an interesting interplay, which is kind of which was important because of this idea of an adaptive reuse and applying contemporary energy demands to a building like this, but retaining that character.
So we're going to go from an urban, or what we were calling a campus, but an urban interior, to what we like to call an urban building. This is the project for a 300,000 square foot building in Harlem that we were awarded through the New York City Economic Development Corporation. But actually, one of the most important aspects of the project was kind of an urban pass-through that we created, a garden pass-through. So it was kind of everything but the building was sort of the most important part of the project.
And this diagram obviously gets at that idea. And it's a mid-block pass-through, which of course is rather atypical. It happens, but it's atypical for New York City, or especially for Manhattan. So in these sort of ground plane floor plans, not only that open pass-through, but also the lobbies. There were 2 lobbies because the building was so long. It was about 382 feet long. So the east and west lobbies were also thought of to be connective. So one could walk through the eastern lobby, move through the rear yard of the building to this pass-through, going from 126th Street up above to 125th Street down in the bottom part of the slide.
And this is this idea again of, I mean, this is the site, but kind of thinking in terms of the overall kind of urban context and really the design of the project. And I think the reason why we were awarded the project was to do with this sort of larger urban move. So these are just images of that pass-through, that public space, as part of the sort of larger project. And then, of course, designing a facade, and then going back to the images of the grid.
Designing the facade in New York City, or in many buildings, is a gridded endeavor, and we enjoyed kind of slightly shifting that grid to kind of make it quite apparent.
And then also in terms of just the landscape of that sort of pass-through that we were interested in, is this sort of amenity to the city, this garden pass-through. And that's the
here's
project
the site
under construction.
ready for construction, which is kind of where the project is at right now.
We're going to now jump scale and go to a couple of exhibition designs we did for the artist or photographer and filmmaker Andrew Zuckerman. And we did several, it's a single show of some photographs that he took for a book called Wisdom. And we were given actually the challenge to create an exhibition design in what this first site location is in the Winter Garden at the World Financial Center. And so we didn't have a traditional sort of gallery space, so we had to create one. So in what is basically a mall. So we decided to just create this donut that included this sort of grid of palm trees that were there, and began to think about kind of placemaking even just through a surface. So think about the picnic blanket or the Carl Andre sort of pieces on the floor of the gallery. So this was just the plan with the sort of grid of the palm trees, and then the different pieces that are just constantly turning 90 degrees from one another, so that any point that you entered the donut, you were sort of seeing these images. And then the idea of kind of seeing it from far away or close up, from far away you recognize it as a sort of donut, but as you were there you sort of just understand this sort of semicircular pattern on the floor.
And text, of course, played into this.
Yeah, so part of the piece was the portraits and then the text. And this is then the piece that went to Sydney, Australia. And the idea here again was to extend the boundaries of the sort of gallery space and with some of the text. But these are some of the images of inside the gallery itself.
Yeah, so as Stella said, this is in Sydney, Australia, that the show traveled to several different locales. And this idea of the disengagement of the words of the people whose images and who spoke these words, but their words were disengaged and then ran around the gallery, as well as running out into other areas of the museum.
Yeah, so then we went outside that gallery space and then into sort of the public spaces and in the bathrooms, sort of allowed that text to keep running and then back into some of the other spaces. So kind of really trying to extend or expand that idea of sight. And this is a project of an art installation
This is actually an art installation.
in Chengdu,
It comes
China. We
together.
were invited to do a piece at the Design Biennale.
And so in looking at site, and go to the next thing, you know, we were interested in making the piece not just something to look at, but something to engage with physically. It became the sort of central square, if you will, of the project.
And we were looking at the macro and micro ideas of site, so.
But really, it all began with this idea of the sort of the children's adage of if you dig a hole deep enough in the ground, you'll reach China. And we thought about not just the fact that one might do that, but also when one does that, you obviously engage the issues of global resources, right, and sharing of resources. And we actually, we were interested in the piece, you know, having a live element that needed to be kept alive during the show and then replanted. So there are these trees that were growing up and down. So the idea is that the piece could rotate around the globe, and the trees, some trees would always be upside down and others would always be
They shared
right
a
side
root
up.
ball.
And they shared the root ball that you're seeing there.
But then we also wanted to create this sort of bleacher seating, so it became actually the sort of the social collector and a place for people to gather. So these are the sort of
the trees grew upside down.
right. But you know, generally people then just ended up using the piece, and we really enjoyed it for that.
So we're going to run through 3 houses.
Very quickly.
Quickly.
And then we're going to
And then
slow
we're
down
gonna
with
slow
the last one. So, and basically the theme for all of these houses is always about a very particular site and framing a landscape.
So this is an important diagram for this house because we were interested in perhaps dematerializing the architecture and showing that it prioritized what the house looked out to and how its interior spaces framed those views as opposed to sort of being more internalized itself.
And what is in almost all the houses that we've designed, we're always looking as you're going through the house is really just an instance along a path and never sort of a terminus. So we're always looking at kind of, as you enter, you're also exiting, but it also gets to that ambiguity of entry, sort of that idea of what we were talking about with Duchamp. Most of our houses, like you don't really, there's not a really formal front door, the front door, back door. Many times there's like kind of multiple points of entry, and we like that informality. And then just the sort of very muted palette of the indoors that frame the sort of landscape on the outside. This is a project, this is a house in Princeton, New Jersey. This was a different kind of way of framing landscape in a very small courtyard, so you sort of get the distance of the landscape and then a sort of close proximity inside the house itself. And then different windows that sort of frame those views and are sort of shifting depending on what's going on the inside of the space itself. And again, this sort of terminus at certain points where you get a window that's at the height of a kitchen counter and then a central garden.
So the architecture and the placement of the windows is really dictated by what views it's looking out to and the relative position of the activity that one is doing, whether sitting, standing, or lying down.
Right. And then this sort of layering of spaces, this is taken from the inside kitchen, looking towards that inner courtyard, back to the sort of library, and then the sort of spaces out. So that kind of layering of indoor and outdoor, and sort of seeing this sort of garden spaces close up and far away, and then this sort of jumping of the different window frames, and that kind of playing and shifting of those views. And then this house in Long Island really played off of, it's sort of like one of these things is not like the other. There's a real, that kind of challenging the kind of traditional front yard, backyard. And this was a 3-pronged house that really began to look at 3 different sort of yard conditions. And then these 3 very simple bars that came together towards the middle of the house. And you actually kind of, the driveway is then not the circle drive at the front, but you drive through the house towards this sort of rear yard. And the idea of outdoor space on the indoor, on this second floor. That then becomes that sort of central core of the house itself, full of light, still sort of very much about sort of framing some of those views on the inside and the outside and that kind of blurring. This is actually the area where you drive underneath this sort of bridge. And the quality of light and just dealing with thinking very much about the sort of site specificity of the space itself. And then we're just now going to slow down on this one last house that we just finished. And this was the first house we ever built that then we just did an addition and a guest house.
So this image is a little bit bewildering. It's actually taken from a drone. It's an aerial image, aerial photograph. And on the very left of the screen for you, the original house that Stella's pointing at is then connected by a very skinny glass bridge to essentially 2 bedrooms and a garage space. And then to the right, or essentially in the middle, is a bathhouse, guest house, and studio space. And then all these forms are then enveloped by a path system, plantings, and the sort of melding of landscape in and around these buildings. But for us, it was just obviously to go back to your first project, your first house project, and to be able to add to it was interesting. The first house, as you can see on the left, was a series of long linear attenuated forms.
With these sort of square, large of window frames.
And the piece that we added was essentially just sort of almost like a perfect cube, a block. And then to connect them was an exercise in not trying to meld, but just to create, just sort of this, a moment of complete difference where you're just sort of hovering in the air. And then framing, the buildings framing one another. And this image on the left we really love because that glass bridge is sort of piercing the end of the original end of the house.
And the siding on the house is a blackened cedar siding, and there's actually a very particular kind of screw pattern in the sort of the grid of the sort of the siding itself, and the kind of layering of the black on black, and then the sort of square frame within the sort of square building. And we love the sort of play of light and shadow, for instance, in this view. This is sort of a detailed image of it.
And this, obviously, this sort of, the grid, some of the early grid images that we were talking about, just, in this case, let's say inscribing the grid like, Agnes Martin did with her pencil, but doing it with just a pattern of stainless steel screws on a very black, inky facade. We really enjoyed that. And also kind of going back to early work that we both did with placing the squares, on drawings, this kind of facade of a building then reflects some of these like very, very early ideas about placing a very simple object in a larger field.
And then the sort of
landscape in that one.
I want to talk about landscape.
In the previous slide. You told me you did.
There's a nice landscape there. Well, actually, what we were going to also talk about is just the change in the sort of here where it has the kind of light and shadow, and here where you get the kind of even finish. And then the contrast to the interiors, which then becomes all about this very light space, again, framing the landscape, these washes of these skylights, and creating a very kind of serene space. But then here, and then the kind of rhythm as you're going down the corridor, this is where that sort of frameless bridge occurs, and then when you kind of see to either side. But now we're going to get to the guest house quickly.
The guest house is counter to some earlier projects that we showed, is a cast-in-place concrete building with a roof garden, a roof deck with a garden on it, and is surrounded by this kind of incredible planted landscape and a moss garden.
So we started the project just by, looking at the original house and then the guest house in terms of its siding. Went through a whole series of modeling processes. Actually, the owner kind of gave us the prompt that he really wanted it to feel like a ruin. So we were thinking about ruins and kind of building models as if that would eventually kind of become a ruin. And then we built the model out of concrete, and this sort of process of casting and the negative cast of the concrete, and then just photographing the models and thinking about the sort of square and the squares within the squares and the sort of shifting. So what we just talked about in the elevation was kind of happening planimetrically for us. And then this is sort of the final form of the house. And one of the things to note is the sort of windows that you'll see in the, on the interior shots as well. All the sort of public rooms, if you will, the living spaces kind of get the larger window frames, and then any of the sort of smaller rooms get the, and each facade gets a treatment like that.
And we're really interested in this sort of material of cast-in-place concrete that obviously begins as liquid and becomes solid, but also takes on the textures of the formwork that you put up against it. So in this case, any place that, as Stella was talking about the windows, any place that the windows punch through the concrete facade, the formwork was very, very smooth and soft to the touch, whereas the main faces of the house and the fireplace here are very rough and board formed. They're formed with rough sawn pine lumber in these horizontal striations that then, thank you for remembering that, Dylan. The board's calibrated perfectly to the
I think
steps.
it's coming. Yeah, it's coming in this sort of side of the house.
And that's the sort of expression of the underside of the stair that goes up to this
There
roof
it is.
deck.
Right. So the sort of detail of the board-formed concrete is aligning with the steps itself, and that sort of texture. And what's so amazing about the sort of cast-in place is you have sort of the positive and the negative. So the formwork for it is then that you get the sort of the texture of the wood in the material itself. And then in this case, the kitchen, the small kitchen, the counter shooting out through, so that becomes a place sort of if you're outside to sort of wash hands or
clean the vegetables
clean
from
the vegetables
the garden on the roof.
Yeah. So this is the sort of just the small kitchen with that counter that then goes out.
Looking back towards the black stained house.
Yep.
All of the wood that you're seeing in the image was harvested from the site. There were a couple of white oak trees that were taken down, and then they were dried for about a year and a half, and then reused to make the cabinet doors, which, playing off against the horizontal striations, the wood vertical, boards in this incredibly rich sort of honey color was really just warmed up that part of the house.
And then just one of the studio spaces that are actually obviously on the other side of the stairs. And then this is that stair going up to the garden. And utilizing this sort of smaller aperture. And then here you see the sort of a bedroom shot, again, kind of thinking about the campsite. All the windows are actually doors, and they pocket into, so it feels like a ruin. This is completely open. And the idea that sort of, as you're lying down on the pillow, you're kind of looking into that outdoor space. It's a very small room. It's a very small house, actually.
So when the door slides into the wall, it just feels as if, the house has no windows in that area.
And that's that living room space again, looking out towards, and then the last aspect of the house, which, whoops, not there yet. So again, just the sort of framing. And then the back is this kind of based on a traditional sort of Japanese bath. So this whole sort of bathing quarters. And the mix of kind of light from above, landscape coming in, but then always sort of framing that view.
And then in the next slide, the bath, as you can see, is another square within this square of the house. The window that looks onto it is almost a perfect square. So really just like, did you mention homage to the square?
Yeah.
Is sort of, a subtitle to the project.
And then here, the dusk shot.
The dusk shot where the glow of electric light inside the building in the evenings really illuminates literally the apertures that are cut through the concrete walls. It's a kind of a completely different reading from the daytime.
Yeah. So that's the last slide. But so just kind of that sort of framework of the work itself and the translation of some of these ideas of scale and texture and
the grids
and
Yep.
just and patterning and iteration.
But I think what we're really interested in is working through these principles, these key principles, as Stella said, coming from other artwork, the artwork that we were involved in, as a means of arriving at architecture, not as a means of kind of creating another thing, let's say, or moving away from architecture. We think that these key principles are, they're part of, let's say, creative practice at many different scales, and in our case, they enable us to come back and address the kind of these, the key principles of art help us address the key principles of architecture.